I'm Bree Landry. I was asked by Hannah to come and talk about reproductive justice. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I just, that's not my job. But I do have a lot of information on the topic. But I kind of wanted to start off with an intro of explaining who I am and where this information is coming from. Even though, like my shirt, I don't know if y'all can read it. Ban off my bodies. Like I want to respect everyone's point of view. But so I am a cisgender white woman. So a lot of this information is coming from a place of privilege, and I do birth work on occasion, so I'm a doula on the side. And I mostly came to be a doula because the maternity mortality rate in Texas and the US is very disturbing, and I thought that was the way I could help and contribute to helping with that. So that's me. Kind of wanted to, let's see, I did have my notes. And I kind of wanted to hear what everyone else, what their thoughts were, maybe what's on their minds, considering this is a very hot topic right now, and what comes to mind when you think of reproductive justice, abortion, women's health. Let's see, what is on your heart right now that's heavy, possibly, if anyone wants to jump in. No pressure.
Well, I'll say something. I'm Chip Bach. I am a married white male, also coming from a place of quite a bit of privilege. I know there are women in my life who I know have had abortions, and I think that gives me a little bit different perspective, perhaps. Because certainly, I think one of the things that hurts me as a male, perhaps more, is the fact that it seems to have divided us more. It's another national issue that divides us.
So division and maybe knowing someone who had an abortion, and I should point out statistically everyone knows someone who had an abortion. Any other thoughts?
I remember my friend going to Mexico for an abortion before Roe versus Wade. And as it turned out, it was a good outcome for her. But I also remember when I was younger than that in high school, people saying, I think I'm pregnant, what do I do? And of course, they were asking other high school students who were pretty ignorant about the subject.
Mm-hmm. Anybody on Zoom? Just giving you an opportunity.
Yeah, I had, someone else.
We can hear you.
Go ahead, Hannah.
Someone else was starting to speak. I had also heard, like, statistically, I probably know many people who've had an abortion, but yet I can only think of a handful of people who have told me that, or like talked about it. And I just think, like, about why that is. Like, is it the like amount of shame or stigma, and like what I can do to feel like a safer person to talk about that with.
think the word abortion is very, very heavy. It can bring fear and guilt, and for some people, though, it's just science, it's just a medical term. It can be a very scary word for a lot of people, even if you are pro-abortion or not pro-abortion. But yeah, so if we go back to the everyone knows someone, and yeah, I think you're right, Hannah. It has a lot to do about shame, and it's not being very socially accepted, which is interesting because as long as people could get pregnant, people have not wanted to be pregnant. It's a problem that we've tried to solve for a very long time in human standards. Yeah, and that fear of not wanting to share with people because of that stigma. One of the things I know I've been kind of struggling with recently with this topic is I know a lot of well-intended men and allies, and it took someone sharing a story for them to get interested, and they still have gaps in their education, and it can be frustrating, but they are, still very well-meaning, and it frustrates me that we have to share our trauma to even get to that point. But again, that's my personal feelings. But yeah, it does create a lot of division, and I think a lot of that has to deal with our belief system. So the big question I think that everyone faces when it comes to this topic is when does life begin? And that's not a simple question. And even okay, let's take science, and when does life actually begin on a cellular level? But then when does a fetus become a person, personhood? Which is kind of funny way someone is trying to ask that question right now is that lady in Houston who she took the carpool lane and got pulled over, and the police officer asked her, where's the other person you're driving with? And she pointed to her belly and said she was pregnant. Where does that personhood start? And religiously and legally, there's a lot of different answers out there. And in theory, America is about respecting different people's religions. And that's not what this Supreme Court has decided to pursue. But what about, what do y'all think about where does life start? Where does personhood start? I would imagine it'd be a variety of answers. It's a big question. It's one of those big Quaker questions, I think. Religious question.
I'm very taken by, there's no other point where you're required to do something to sustain someone else's life. Mm. You're not required to donate blood or organs, even though they might save a life. To me, therefore, the answer is life begins when it can be sustained safely outside somebody else's life.
Yeah, that's a good point. If we truly valued everyone's life, what would our society look like? Would the default be when you go to get your license, it would already say organ donor? Because, or would it be like a mandate to give blood regularly? Or would there be even going like in policy, universal health care, if we think that everyone's life matters? But does anyone else want to talk about when life begins?
I see Larry has his hand up.
I can't read. Go ahead.
Okay, I think in one sense this is fairly straightforward, in another sense it's fairly complicated. In order to promote our social cohesion and cooperation was promoted by an innate ability that was bred into us to recognize other people as having value similar to our own. And that's it's not very well bred into us. It requires a personal connection for it to be solidified. And that's why we were able to have slavery for much of our existence as a species until the invention of the novel. Once and it's not only its invention, but its widespread proliferation. Once people could get into the minds of someone they didn't know, that a fictional character, it then became easier for them to project themselves into the minds of slaves, and that's when slavery began to decline, is right after the invention of the novel. So it's not entirely biological, it's also sociological. However, what's happened is that people have a special quality in our minds, that is one of us. A person is one of us. And as such, they have certain inalienable rights that is written in the Declaration of Independence. And what's happened is that, and you also asked when does life begin, and I'll get to that in a moment. But what's happened is that people who are against abortion have projected that usness onto fetuses. And in fact, we aren't bred to do that. And in order to do that, they have to have an abstract image of the fetus as being an actual baby. They would not, if you showed them a collection of cells and says, is this a person? They say, well, no, that doesn't look like a person to me. And then if you told them that it was a fetus, they say, oh yeah, that's a person. So the problem is that there's this conflation of fetuses with this personhood, and personhood has this special quality that is bred into us of usness. Now, when does life begin? Well, obviously, a collection of cells gestating in the mother's womb is alive. But is it a person? No, it's not a person in the sense that we have been bred to think of people as persons or entities as persons. I mean, you could ask the same question about AI intelligences. Are they sentient or merely sapient? And on and on. And it all goes back to how we were evolved to view people. And how we were evolved to view people was in a very narrow context that is difficult to apply to life today. That wasn't entirely coherent, but it was most of what I have of my thoughts about it.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, I think that says a lot about kind of what we were saying earlier about sharing stories and how powerful they can be, and how they can affect our society. Also with the one of us statements, like when abortion used to not be super contentious. I know that's hard to believe now. But it was, more people were farmers, and like we understood that like a 2-year-old cow, we still understand that like a 2-year-old cow should not give birth, and so you do an abortion, or incest would affect your stock. So, but then ultrasound came along, and we were able to project and see a human, possibly, in a fetus and see human features.
Thursday night, only Friday and yesterday.
That was kind of a revelation to, and we had to ask ourselves those questions of when does life actually begin? Is this a life? Is it a person? Kind of where that began. Someone else had their hand risen. I don't see it anymore. Oh, wait. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I did my doctoral dissertation on defining personhood, and I ended up with a book called Defining Personhood Toward an Ethics of Quality in Clinical Care. So I looked at personhood of the patients in a big family practice unit. And one of the things that I noticed most is that there is no set of necessary and sufficient conditions that make up a person, like a checklist we could check off. Personhood is, as Larry had suggested, a recognition of us as a recognition. It's socially constructed so that what a person is, who a person is, depends on at least 26 different factors. Ethnicity, sometimes religion, self-consciousness, autonomy, rationality, having capacity for emotions, family. So there's so many features of personhood that you can't really say when it begins, but it is socially constructed. And one of the most awful things that philosophers have done is to beg the question, either way, those who, and certainly in the abortion debate today, those who assume that the fetus, the embryo, and even the conceptus is a person are begging the question, assuming what they're supposed to be proving is they're assuming from the start that it is a person, and then they're concluding that therefore killing it is murder. Whereas those who also on the pro-choice side, so to speak, say it's not a person, they also beg the question because they're assuming in advance it's not a person. Although I tend to see that pro-choice view more relying on science and the fact that, as someone said, the viability, the survivability of the fetus is rather dubious. And of course, the problem with Roe v. Wade was that it used viability as one of the two principles on which the right to abortion was based. And the other one, the right to privacy, it seems to me is definitely privacy of, say, the person, any possible personhood of the conceptus or embryo or fetus. That, well, the right to privacy seems to me to cover those of us in the womb before we are born. So Quakers tried not to beg the question, and we wrestled with this in New York early meeting, and I remember the session down in, I guess it was 15th Street meeting in New York, where a big group of Quakers came up with the idea that friends were going to say that personhood was somewhat socially constructed, but we were not going to take a position on what point the embryo, fetus, and I don't think we talked about the conceptus, would be persons. What we were going to do was say that women deserved to have privacy, and that we were hoping that women would make better choices, that we wanted to support women, educate women. And when women are educated, they say, for instance, calculus is the best birth control there is. But when women are educated, we make better choices, and we choose. And many times we choose to have a child that might be a choice that others might not make. So that's what Friends came up with. But personhood is definitely socially constructed, and there's no way that I think that an embryo or a conceptus, whose existence is maybe not even known yet, could be considered a full-blown person, especially not legally. and to do what some of the people have done, which is to say that every abortion ought to be illegal, is just to ignore the medical facts. The medical facts of the need for certain DNCs after miscarriages, and to ignore other medical facts. So if we're going to make all abortions illegal, we'd have to have police in the bathrooms once a month or throughout the month to honor and declare personhood for the waste in the wastebasket, because it's a gross subject, but it's really not the case, since a third of all pregnancies aren't even recognized. We don't even know they happen before they wipe out naturally in the monthly cycle. So a conceptus in the trash certainly can't have the status of personhood. And the usually white males who are ignorant of human biology, who wish that to be the case, are, I think they're really just hiding the agenda of wanting to control women, and it's some kind of womb envy in these men, some kind of pathological womb envy. Anyway, personhood. We should pay attention to it in the quality of care and the way we treat women and girls and each other generally. But it's not something that applies to an embryo or a conceptus or a gamete. Even now we're having birth control be banned by some of these ignorant people. Oh, I don't want to keep talking or I get really angry.
Thanks for sharing. Howard?
One of the things that I always look to maybe come out of discussions like this is at least a start toward action, so what we can do to make the current climate better and move toward something more sane in terms of reproductive rights. There's a little historical fact that some of you may know and may know better than me, so please correct me, but there's a guy named Franklin Schaeffer. He was the son of a father and son team of religious right activists, and Franklin Schaeffer Jr. kind of turned and became more opposed to what the religious right was doing. But he says that in the early 70s, or maybe even late 60s, a bunch of, there was a small conference of people, leaders in the religious right and in the political right, trying to figure out how to get more purchase, in the, more influence over people, and how to get more people. And they talked about that. They said we can't just go with one issue, which at the time was civil rights and integration. They were opposed to that, and so the religious right movement really got started because they wanted to they wanted to have their own schools where they wouldn't have to integrate. So they were going to be religious schools, so they couldn't be controlled under the Supreme Court, decisions about public schools integrating. And so he says, what other issues can we come up with to get people fired up besides that? And they had a long discussion. A lot of the red flag topics that we know today, LGBTQ, what we would today call LGBTQ rights, that was opposition to that was a big thing that they came up with. Gun rights, and they said, yeah, that's work, but what else? And that doesn't sound like it'll do it. And finally, someone said, well, what about abortion? And the reaction from everyone was, oh no, that's just a Catholic thing. You'll never get Protestants interested in that. No, and so the response from Franklin Schaeffer said was, let us work on that for a few years. We'll get them, and they did. So I think it's worth maybe thinking about how we got into that, how our society got into that, you know, that mindset, and how people were able to be brought along to that, because we've got to find a way out of this.
Yeah, I think looking at the origin story is also very interesting and, like you said, helpful. I think the topic of education has also come up a few times. I think that our sex ed education, if that was improved, would help a lot. Like what was said about men not knowing a lot about female anatomy, women don't know a lot about female anatomy. Or in sex ed currently, it's more male focused. And you could also prevent unwanted pregnancies if you start sex ed. That's where the science says is having access to birth control and education is what will prevent unwanted pregnancies. But yeah, what Howard kind of was talking about too, about talking about abortion and trying to, agenda sounds like a big word, but having that as an agenda to make that a broader topic of contention. Let's see, but before, are we on time? One of the other topics when it comes to reproductive justice is when women have the choice, when pregnant people who can have a pregnancy have the choice to delay pregnancy, the statistics show that they are less likely to live under the poverty line. They have more resources to take care of the kid that is wanted. Another topic that comes up a lot about unwanted pregnancies is that, well, you can give up the kid for adoption, and that's not a cure-all. First of all, being pregnant is not a neutral medical event, especially in Texas. In the US, it is very dangerous compared to other places in the world. Our maternity mortality rate is very disturbing, and that affects people of color a lot more. It's having a baby and being pregnant is also very expensive. I'm sure there's a few stories in the room about how much they paid for their pregnancy. I know my grandmother, who had 2 C-sections, it was about like $300, and you stayed in the hospital for quite a few days. And nowadays, the average hospital stay for giving birth, this isn't including medical appointments beforehand, is about over $2,000. And considering how many people don't have health insurance in Texas or in the United States, that is not a small sum. So forced birthers don't seem to acknowledge that and like to focus on the adoption aspect. Does anyone have anything they want to add? James?
Yeah, gosh, I really appreciate everything people have been saying so far. And sorry to back up just a little bit, but I was sort of going back to the question of personhood. And I think that's sort of the biggest fault line, as you were saying, Debris, in this debate in our society. And I was listening to a lot of the sort of historical points that people were making, that the definition of personhood has changed between societies. Historically, sadly, in our own society, personhood of Black people, of women, has been denied. And I worry that if we take the fact that personhood shifts, that's true. Historically, that's true. I think one of the great Quaker contributions has been not being relativistic about personhood, though. It was the case that a lot of societies treated Black people as not being persons. And I think the great Quaker moral insight was that that's not true, that even though society might not see someone as a person, that they are a person. Even though society doesn't see women as full people, that they are women. And so there's this deep, I think one of the great moral strengths of Quakerism is not being relativist about this, not being historically, knowing that these things do change from history, but that there's a truth that's higher than that, or that's more important than that, and that we have a connection to that truth. And so because of that, I'm very skeptical of the idea that because it is historical, that we can say then therefore, oh, well, we can just say then that they're not, that fetuses aren't persons. And that's, it seems, it doesn't follow, I don't think, from historical relativism to a point about the personhood of a fetus. And my big concern is I feel like in the past, when we've been more expansive in our definition of personhood, we've been more in the right. When we've been very restrictive about thinking of who is a person, when we say women aren't people, when we say Black people aren't people, when we say all these people aren't people, we did horrible, horrible wrong in the world. And my great fear is that we say, okay, well, this group isn't people. We can say now this, we limit who is a person, and thus we can do any amount of violence and harm to people who we exclude from that. And I think as Quakers, we should just be very, very hesitant about saying definitively that any being is not a person.
Thanks, James. Yeah, that's true. Black people being 3/5 of a person was actually in law, and even less than. And when it comes to reproductive justice, the history of Black women being tested on without anesthesia is exactly how we have modern medicine to take care of women, which is very disturbing. And because the goal was to make sure that Black women could reproduce just like cattle. And to do that, they had to do some testing and some science in a very disturbing manner. There was something else that you said, James. What was it? Yeah, so I think, in all honesty, I think it's totally fine if you think the fetus along a certain point is a person. The main problem is imposing that belief on other people. And it gets very messy because when you do lose a pregnancy, either from abortion or miscarriage, it can be very emotional. And that's okay. You can hold the belief that this is not a person and still be sad in the opportunities that were lost. You can believe it was a person and mourn it. And then there's the idea of long-term abortion. So we're getting more to the point of this fetus can live outside of a person, but there are birth defects. That's normally the case for long-term abortion. They won't survive much longer outside the womb, or if they do, it'll be a very painful life and very short. And what does that mean for that family or that pregnant person. That could be very tricky, moral, like battleground for that person going through that, and it just got a lot harder. Who is, I can't read that. Purple shirt. You had your hands up a while ago. Was that live? But yeah.
Yes, Gelia.
Yeah.
And I last week I listened to 1A. I don't know if anyone had an opportunity to hear that particular show, and it was something I didn't know anything about. It was very interesting. They were talking about the there's the civil rights of various groups, and they said, who gets to have civil rights in this country? Is it just conservative Christians, for example? Do they choose these things, and then everybody falls in line, with that? And it was wide opening to me to realize that well, there's a temple in Florida that has a lawsuit that's countering this and saying that among Jewish sects that there are various degrees of thought on this issue. But one of the things is if a woman cannot take care of this child, or if it causes harm to her or her ability psychologically or physically, then she must let this baby go, in abortion. Their point of was even that in some sects it's as much as a year and a half old before they truly identify them as a person, which might be hard for some of us to go with, but that nevertheless that is still a thought that's out there. And additionally, there was a Muslim group there that was saying that they follow fairly closely with that as well, that if a woman is unable to do it mentally, physically, financially, that it is felt that is the best thing, and it is what they should do. And they're, so so this is something like, well, where is human rights in this, and why do we take one stance versus another? They said it much better than I did, but what was interesting too, how we're talking about what can we do, they do have the rabbi has this lawsuit. He says anyone's welcome to take it and run with it. We could, anyone, if we wanted to, we could take the wording of that and submit that too as a lawsuit to this action. Don't know if that's what we're called to do, but this is something that is an action that could be taken. It was also just very interesting. I would recommend it. I want to go back and listen to it again because I was going to a doctor's appointment, so I had a little gap there of that I couldn't hear. But it was very interesting, and to think of it in a different way, because we've only been told the one side. We've all been listening to this, the one that's been beating this drum so loudly. So and it was really interesting.
Yeah, I also listened to that episode. I have a document that I'll share later today with some links, and I'll add that one to it. But there was, yeah. Sure.
Can we share the podcast too?
Yeah, I'll add that for sure. There's one, I also has one on contraceptives that they did a few weeks ago too. That was good. There's a few hands up. Oh, did you have a question, Chip?
I do have a question. So we've talked a little bit about this issue since the Supreme Court made their decision on peace and social concerns, and in Peace and Social Concerns Committee, there was some discussion. I guess what I'm curious, let me just come to Jason. So I know different people are going to have different approaches, but we talked about the Lilith Fund and our support for that years ago, and some discussion that wasn't necessarily supported by friends, no longer support that. So I'm kind of curious of the history of where, I don't want to say where we stand, because that's the wrong way to say it. But is there community makes sense.
Yeah, for Quaker history, I'm not very well versed. But it sounded like, can't remember her name. I just can't read anything on the screen.
If you want to speak, go ahead and unmute
Yeah.
and speak.
Larry or someone else has their hand risen too.
It's Sally is the other person. So either of you guys can unmute and speak.
Thanks, Sal.
I wanted to affirm what James said, believe it or not. When I found empirically from studying the features of personhood, many different ones, when I found that it's socially constructed, I was not being a moral relativist. That's descriptive relativism, which shows that there are differences in when we construct personhood. I, for instance, thought of each of my children as persons from the time I knew they were conceived or even tried to conceive them, because I wanted those children, and I had an education, and I had a loving situation, I thought, to bring them into. But moral relativism is different. That says we should never say when someone is a person, or we should take anybody's old view of what counts as a person, and that blacks didn't and women didn't fully. That's definitely something Friends have always been opposed to. But I did want to highlight that there was a strong tradition, and this is at least 50 years ago, that we in New York Yearly Meeting decided to just support women in making better choices, to educate girls and women as a means of dealing with reproductive issues. And so it's not so much a question of the personhood that is vague. We can construct that with various features like consciousness, autonomy, and that's gradually constructed over our lives. But the confusion is about humanness. Your toenail and your hair follicles are human. That's kind of the black and white issue. It's either a human cell or it's not a human cell, or it's the 99% of humans genetically that are the same as all other creatures on Earth. But we have to look at the fact that not everything human is a person, and not every conceptus that is probably not viable is a person. Not every an unimplanted one or an implanted one. And so the fetus goes through many phases earlier before it's a fetus that are very dubious in terms of legal personhood, but they're always human. And so saying something is a human, I guess, is just means people think it's, in a confused way, a human being. But a human being would be more of a person, not just human. And then there are animals. A lot of our four-leggeds are persons in the household. We have a person here who's a black-mouthed cur, and she has many characteristics of personhood, but she's not human. And people treat, various four-leggeds differently. But we do need to be firm in not being moral relativists, in saying there is a harm that we do when we either force a person to have an abortion or force a person to carry a pregnancy full term, especially that 10-year-old girl. So I think the consensus that Friends have developed over the years, that I've actually heard in the processing, is to support women and girls and do something about that, as Howard said, to affirm their autonomy, the value of them, that of God in them, and every person.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I think it's also a point that can be forgotten sometimes, is that in this conversation, it comes up that having an abortion is maybe like the hardest decision they'll ever do in their entire life. And that's normally the end of that conversation. But there are some people who it's not a hard decision, and that's okay, because they believe it's not a person, or they always knew they didn't want to have a child, they can be very firm in that belief and not have guilt, and that is okay. Larry, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I also had some, well, I actually am more confused than Sally about the notion that because in the past we have not ascribed personhood to people who obviously are we now recognize as people, persons, and because of that we cause great harm, that means I'm not sure exactly what was being said, but it seemed like what was being said was that we should not deny personhood to anything. And that boggles my mind, because where do you stop? I mean, I had breakfast just now, and I killed several grains of oats when I did that. If they're persons, that means I'm a murderer. Well, you might think that's ridiculous, but on the other hand, if we're not going to deny personhood to oats, why am I not a murderer? And of course, the Jains, they don't kill anything except what they absolutely need in order to sustain life. However, I am not a Jain, and I have not ascribed to that view of every living thing is sacred, because once again, where do you stop? I mean, I recall the Monty Python skit about every sperm is sacred. Is a sperm a person? And is killing it murder? Does that mean I can't engage in contraception? I mean, by refraining from ascribing personhood, or allowing everything to be persons, it puts me in a pickle as far as to how the practical living of my own life and that of others. I mean, am I going to go around and start arresting, doing citizens arrest of pesticide controllers because they're killing insects? I am very confused by this notion that I should refrain from ascribing personhood to some things and not to others.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Larry. So we're kind of coming up on an end right now. Hannah, do you have something you want to say?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this ties into the idea of personhood, and like when it's expansive, or when we're limiting who we're thinking of as people, in terms of age and like minors. Because I just picked up a book at my brother's house, and it was about like the women who they didn't have the choice to get an abortion, but then they went to these homes to give birth, and then they couldn't keep their babies. And I didn't really know much about this, but it wasn't really a choice. They were like tricked or lied to, and their babies were taken from them. And it's just like a collection of the stories of these people who, and it also relates to like how when we hear the stories, it changes our view. Because maybe it would have been hard for me to understand like giving away a child before, but these people, the women in these homes, really didn't feel like people because they were forced to give their child away. So it's a little different. It's not about like being forced to have birth, but being forced to have birth and then like lose your child because they were either unmarried or too young in what society viewed was okay, to have children.
Thanks, Hannah. James, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to sort of respond to Larry's confusion there, or his question. I feel like when we make a boundary between what is a person, what is not, the unfortunate tendency is the thing that's on person side get all of these legal rights and protections. Whatever we put on the other boundary side is subject to unlimited violence, no protection to our society, and no care. That's what happens to animals now. I'm not saying that animals deserve exactly the same rights as humans, of course, that would be silly, but at the same time, we do huge and terrible, terrible things to animals that are just horribly violent and catastrophically cruel. And we shouldn't be okay with it. And I think we should be more expansive in the range of things that we give ethical concern for, or that we give compassion to. And I would put a boundary at anything that can experience pain. So I think, Larry, you can feel okay eating your oats this morning. They probably didn't experience any pain in the process of being harvested. But anything that can suffer, I think we should give real moral weight to. And it's always going to be tricky how much to give. And so I think we should give moral weight to fetus and even embryonic life if it can experience pain and if it can suffer. There is a weight there.
Yeah, thanks, James. I also think, like, that when it comes to fetuses, and feeling pain, is that pain going to continue with them for the rest of their life? What is the quality of life maybe that child, if it were to get older, how that would work? And if that family can take care of that baby too. There's emotional pain there. That might be going in a different direction than you were saying, James. But kind of, again, coming to an end, my own, like, feelings are, if we think women are persons and we thought they were as equal, then we wouldn't be dying in childbirth, and 60% of them being very, very preventable and would not have happened if you gave birth in a different country. I'll send the list of resources to someone who can share it out, but it'll have looks like I'm sending it to Erica, is that right? And it'll have a whole bunch of articles, and I'll add the podcast. There's some books that are really good, including a study on what happens when abortion isn't available. But I think kind of the call to action is educating yourself. I don't think a lot of people knew that a 10-year-old could get pregnant until recently. And a lot of women have known that for a very long time. So education and support and listening, I think, is the calls to action there. But thanks for having me.
Thank you, Grace.
So much for doing it.
Yeah, it's a topic I enjoy talking about. Enjoy might be too far, but know a lot about it.